Hi, I'm Terri Murphy and welcome to Women in Business. And our guest today is Dr. Gary Burrus, Ph.D., who is an expert at human relations and human resources. And one of the things that he's talked about is men and women working together in the workforce. So tell us a little bit about why that's more important today than it was even 10 years ago.
Well, today it's more important because organizational pyramids have continued to shrink. The hierarchies have grown smaller. And there was a time you used to be able to come in and you start off, you've heard the old saying, started off in the mailroom and retired as the CEO of the company. That's still possible because America's a great country. The issue is the stepping stones have gotten a lot larger now. Technology has come a long way and has taken over a lot of the mundane, repetitive tasks that don't necessarily add value to the company. So the ability to work collaboratively has become more important. More and more companies are relying on collaboration in teams, especially self-driven teams, self-managed teams, in order to be competitive. So for that reason, the collaboration aspect of a lot of companies has become important.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned before, because we've worked together in different forms of leadership and in your consulting with companies, is that there has to be a strategy. And you say that most companies think they do have a strategy when in fact it's really not quite true.
I think strategy as a word gets thrown around a lot, and and I'm not saying that companies don't necessarily have a strategy. I'm saying you should be able to ask penetrating questions, such as, and this happened to me just a few weeks ago. I began to ask about the strategy of the company, and I asked 4 different people at 4 different times that are well placed. And basically what they were, one of them even told me, well, if there's a strategy, it has not been shared with me. And this was in January, so this should have taken place in 4th quarter. So if the concept of strategy is taking last year's budget, dusting it off, adding 10% revenue expectations or cutting 10% expenses, that's not really a strategy. So it has to begin with strategy, which is if you understand your market, what is your unique position in the market for how to compete, and if you understand what you're going to offer that is completely different, then you can begin to build a strategy, and from that then you can begin to build your teams and collaboration flows. But it has to start with who are we, what do we stand for, how do we compete in our market, therefore what's the knowledge, skills, and abilities that our leaders and our teams need to possess.
And that speaks directly to what we always talk about is you have to work from your core values, and everybody on the team has to work for core values. And yet a lot of people put them up on the wall and put them in their, in their company policy, but they don't really live them. So that leads to the next step, which is ask the right questions. What do you mean by that?
Well, again, if you know your strategy, then you can begin to ask your questions. I shared with you that when I was going through grad school years ago, our professors, this one who I just respect, I'd worked so hard on this project, right? Because you're working on a Ph.D., so you want them to think you're smart, so she would look at us, not just me, and when we come up with this great thing, she'd look at us and she'd go, "So what?"
Ooh.
And I was offended. I mean, what do you mean, so what? I worked really hard on this. It was part of a process, and that process is what? What is the issue? What is the problem? What is the thing we're trying to solve as an organization? So what? Okay, so what are we going to do about it? So what are you proposing? And then the third part of that was, now what? Now that we know what you're proposing, if we do those things, will it solve our issue? Now what is the next step to implement it? Because at some point you've got to take these great ideas and you've got to implement those ideas.
And we talk about the Pareto Theory, 80-20 versus 50-50.
Right.
And I know you have some great insight in that.
Right. I teach a class on executive decision making.
And where do you teach that class?
University of Southern Mississippi. And what I tell my graduate students is people like to think of the world as being balanced and being 50-50. And organizations do not need to think 50-50. They do not need to think fair. They do not need to think balanced.
Really?
What they need to think is Pareto's rule. A lot of people know Pareto's rule. If you say the 80-20 principle,
they kind of understand it.
Yeah, 20% of the students make 80% of the A's, 20% of the churchgoers do 80% of the tithes, and it doesn't usually go past there. But there is great economic and business support coming out of the 80-20. If companies take the time to look at what they produce, what they sell, the services they add, if they were to really look at it, the what, they would find that typically 80% of the value that they bring arises from 20% of the input. So Pareto's rule is 80% of the outputs usually arise from 20% of the inputs. Let me be clear, 80-20 does not mean it has to be exactly 80-20. Companies like Apple, for example, and the cell phones, they're more, call it a 95-5, you know? So, and so therefore 80% companies, what I advise them to do is this. Figure out the 20% of the things you do, or the 15, or the 10, whatever it is that produces the lion's share of your revenue, and from that, those are the things you need to focus on. Therefore, what you do next is you take the things that are not in that top 20%. If you can cause them to mimic what your top 20% is doing, that's how you get underperforming projects, products, services. You find out what's wrong with them or what needs to be improved so they mimic the top 20%, they will begin to add value to your bottom line.
Wow.
Ultimately, if you can't make the underperformance mimic the top performance, and it's not going to return to you a lot of value, you need to consider breaking away from that thing, because it's just not something that you need to focus on. Wow. And you need to do that sooner rather than later.
So you can see that there's a whole lot more to this than meets that we're going to get done in this interview, but you don't mind going on. So how does that address women and men collaborating in the workspace?
Well, just that the best ideas ought to win. And talent is dispersed equally amongst the different cohorts of workers. It's dispersed amongst the different ages. It's dispersed amongst the different genders. And organizations should be open to embracing, again, think of 80-20, top 20% of performers. Some organizations, a couple I've worked with, based off what I saw, I'd say that typically you should expect that 30% of your leaders are the ones that are driving 80 or 90% of your value. So those are the people that need to be placed in charge of these teams. So you understand your strategy. You're going to rely on a team approach. You know the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are required to be successful. You search your talent base for those people that have those knowledge, skills, and ability. If it's female, female's in charge.
Who cares?
If it's a male, male's in charge. As we've discussed, that part doesn't matter. It's just a matter of, can they lead? And what's critical for a company, though, is to understand when it comes to men and women working together in collaboration, or the older workers and the younger workers.
That's really prominent
Exactly.
in today's market.
Regardless of that, they need to be able to lead other adult human beings in a collaborative approach.
So I know you do a whole another program, the 9-box theory, on making sure you've got the right people in the right. But obviously this is so much more than companies, and they really could benefit from consulting. Tell us a little bit about your consulting work for companies and corporations.
Well, using the very things we've talked about, I asked those what, so what questions, and that's not always easy to do to a CEO who's not used to having
somebody cry,
or she is not used to having somebody be so specific and to look somebody in the eye and just say, so what? Because they're very busy. I'm 50,000 foot view and I'm snapping my fingers and I'm making big decisions, and I'm like, well, you need to slow down and let's just talk about this thing.
Or we've always done it this way and it's worked just fine.
Right. And I've worked with some clients, and literally the CEO was completely unaware of where the bulk of their revenue was coming from. And when we led them through a process where it's a funnel approach. You start at the general and you work down to the specific. When we got down to the specific, he was shocked that the bulk of his revenue was being generated by a microscopic amount of customers, and those were the customers that they were offending.
Oh.
And I said, sir, you cannot offend these customers. You don't have that kind of value on the backside to make up for those losses. So I gave the CEO an assignment, and I don't know if he had received an assignment before, which was, I'm giving you, I'm giving you 1 week to understand who your customers are, and you personally will call your top 5% of customers. And he did it, to his credit, and it was great for him.
It was revealing. Well, if anybody watching wanted to get some more information from you or talk to you about consulting, how would they do that?
Most likely, the best thing to do is just have them call my cell phone number.
Which is?
662-404-2008. It's with me at all times. And from there, we'll just see if there's anything I can do to help them. You'd be surprised, just surprised at how having someone come in, just ask questions and get people to answer those questions and to keep going through the what, so what, now what, is enough to get them to really begin to fine tune where their needs are. And you'd be surprised. A lot of times the answers are there. A lot of times they bring up their own answers, which is exactly what we want them to do, because I want to enable and I want to empower. And sometimes people just need a guide that allows them to get where they need to be.
That's what a great consultant does, and I've seen you at work and I see that magic. So for more information, it's Gary Burrus, B as in baby, U-R-R-U-S, and they can find you on LinkedIn as well.
Right, yes.
And I'm Terri Murphy. Thanks for joining us for this segment of Women in Business. Tune in again next time.